Let's talk about Herodotus. Herodotus was a Greek man born in every Greek man's favorite place, Turkey. And that's a new land speed record for a Balkan joke on this channel. You are welcome. Herodotus' life made Ernest Hemingway's life look like your life, you fucking loser. Herodotus spent his life traveling the eastern Mediterranean, asking locals about the geography, culture, people, notable events that had occurred in the area, and then writing all those things down. He called this practice learning by inquiry, or in the original Greek, historia. He was later dubbed the father of history by everyone's favorite senatorial daddy, Cicero, and is considered the first historian. He is still, to this day, regarded as the ultimate source of information on the Greek and Persian War, second only to that softcore gay porno. Here's the thing about Herodotus, however. While Cicero dubbed him the father of history, Plutarch, just 100 years after that, dubbed him the father of lies.
Come in disguise.
No, just the first part. It turns out that being the first historian results in you being a pretty shit one. So tell me what you know of this far-off mystical land, this India. Well, it's on the other side of Persia, and giant ants live there. How giant we talking? They're like bigger than a fox, but smaller than a dog. I've never seen a fox. Have you? I have not. But a merchant from Egypt told me they're smaller than giant ants. Man, Herodotus, this shit's pretty wild. I'm beginning to think that just asking random guys about things is, well, it's sort of a terrible method of learning. Don't be ridiculous. Why, you're making about as much sense as the Ethiopian hole people, who shriek like bats. Have you ever heard a bat? No, but I have it on good authority that they moan sensually like your whore of a mother. Do not question my methods. I've written over 30 pages on our war with Persia, and several thousand on the ramblings of madmen. This is clearly excellent time management. But Herodotus was followed by others. Polybius, Plutarch, Cassius Dio. In the Mediterranean, the study and recording of history became a more rigorous discipline as the centuries passed. These histories, written often by enthusiastic and long-winded whack jobs with too much time on their hands, such as yours truly,
you and I are not so different.
I'm not like you.
Are what make classical antiquity such a fascinating time and place to read about. These accounts provide life and vigor and color to these ancient peoples that archaeological evidence and censuses and tax records just can't. But that's enough of that. Let's talk about the Battle of Actium. The Battle of Actium is among the most important events in all of human history. There is so much background.
You didn't have to cut me off.
And while the fall of the Roman Republic and the rise of the Empire remains my favorite time and place in history to read and talk about, now is not the time. How the ancient Romans felt about Egypt, that's the time for that story, coming in 2025. But what's important to note about Actium is that there were two sides fighting for the future of the Roman Empire. On one side, Octavian and Agrippa, and on the other, Mark Antony and Cleopatra. For weeks before the battle, Antony was bleeding men to disease and desertion, so by the time he sailed out to meet Octavian, he was badly outmatched. Antony was an experienced military leader, and he knew that this was just not going to work out. So the plan was to feign engaging in battle before booking it the fuck out of there. Cleopatra, in her flagship, the resplendent gold and purple Antonius, was the first to break out and make for open water, along with the other Egyptian ships. So yeah, she's a dirty, whorish snake of a woman, a decadent eastern slut, surrounded by simpering soft eunuch boys and silk curtains and all manner of luxuries of the decadent East. She abandoned the proud Roman Mark Antony on the day he needed her. In any event, Cleopatra's retreat was a bold move. Prior to battle, the Council of War had decided on a breakout strategy, and Cleopatra was executing it in an exemplary manner. The sources agree that she led the breakout. Indeed, she might have deserved a medal for leading her squadron to safety. Still, some of the ancient authors pour scorn on her. Flavius Josephus, writing a little more than a century after the battle, is the first to criticize her, asserting flatly that Cleopatra deserted Antony. But then, the Jewish historian always criticized Cleopatra, as he was a partisan of her rival king, Herod. Cassius Dio, writing more than a century after Josephus, agrees. He says that she lost her nerve and fled, behaving, says Dio, in a combination of sexism and racism, just like a woman and an Egyptian. We have no idea if Cleopatra was supposed to be the person to initiate the breakout. We don't know if this was all according to plan, or a woman abandoning her lover and ally when he needed her most. But of course, if you consult these ancient sources, well, she did it because she was a woman, and Egyptian, and a coward. This was a portrait painted by sexist, xenophobic men with political agendas. Which, to be clear, I'm not passing judgment. I'm pretty fucking based myself. But the fact of the matter is, if you want to learn about history, you usually can't just take these ancient sources as fact. Oftentimes, these are very fun sources to read, but you need to consider their biases at all times, or at least read a companion book written in modern times by experts, which apply modern academic rigor to the source material. Okay. I get it. You're at your wits' fucking end. You want me to talk about the fucking show? Then fine. All right. Let's talk about HBO's Rome, a show which ran from 2005 to 2007, which covers the fall of the Roman Republic and the rise of the Empire. As a fan of classical antiquity and gratuitous nudity, I'm naturally a pretty big fan. Octavian always presented himself as standing up for traditional Roman virtues. He passed laws to enforce moral standards. He financed the building of many new temples to their gods. This was a purposeful act of propaganda, painting himself as the ideal Roman man. Despite the fact that he feared death, which is a womanish trait, Octavian was not the embodiment of Roman values and traditional masculinity. He was a bookish, rich boy who lacked the stomach for battle, whereas the idealized Roman citizen was a illiterate farmer who fucking loved the idea of dying for the Republic which Octavian destroyed. HBO's Rome took great care to not portray Octavian as he portrayed himself, which is great, to be clear. He was a politician, selling an image, and you've got to be pretty goddamn smooth-brained to buy it. A good citizen of the Roman Republic could also not be the first emperor of Rome. That makes no fucking sense. Let's finally talk about Fire and Blood, the history of the Targaryen dynasty, which was written in-universe by Archmaester Gildain, but was, written in our real and lame and gay universe by George R. R. Martin. Fire and Blood is a history in the tradition of Herodotus, a history drawing from many sources and testimonies years after the fact, and as such, while it is technically a lore book, it is also written by an unreliable narrator, as the many historians of classical antiquity are unreliable narrators of our own real world. So, it's lore with a slant, imperfect lore, filtered through the prejudices and assumptions and incomplete information possessed by characters in the world they're describing. House of the Dragon was based upon this book, directly upon this book. That's fucking fascinating. You're essentially basing a TV show not off of a book, but rather a textbook, retelling events that have never actually been depicted. But and maybe I'm overstating it. The fact that Fire and Blood was written by a maester of the Citadel and is not an authoritative, unquestionably correct text, it's probably just a gimmick, I'm sure. It's not like George R. R. Martin is a history nerd, and here we must digress to say a word about our sources. For much of what happened in the years that followed happened behind closed doors. We have, of course, the chronicles laid down by Grand Maester Runechitter, fuck you, George, and his successors, and many a court document as well, all the royal decrees and proclamations, but these tell only a small part of the story. Unfortunately, this is also true of the two first-hand observers that have come down to us. Septon Eustace, who served in the royal sept at the Red Keep during much of this time, set down the most detailed history of this period. De Balance Eustace, the testimony of Mushroom, based upon the verbal account of the court fool set down by a scribe who failed to append his name. Mushroom was a 3-foot-tall dwarf, possessed of an enormous head, and, he avers, an even more enormous member. I fucking love this man. What's fascinating, however, reading Fire and Blood, is contrasting the simple and incomplete narrative laid out by Gildain with what we see in the show. In 115 AC, there came a tragic mishap, of the sort that shapes the destiny of kingdoms. Lady Rhea Royce fell from her horse while hawking.
I knew you couldn't finish. Craven!
And cracked her skull upon a stone. Viserys Targaryen was not the strongest-willed of kings, it must be said.
I will sit the throne today. Your Grace.
Always amiable and anxious to please, he relied greatly on the counsel of the men around him.
Her children are bastards! And she is a whore.
And did as they bade more often than not.
Will have your tongue for that.
This characterization of Viserys Targaryen doesn't make sense. The entire show is built around the conflict between Rhaenyra Targaryen, the king's chosen successor, who unfortunately is a woman, right? And Alicent Hightower, who wants her sons on the throne. Viserys sticks by that fucking decision for over 2 decades, even though everyone hated it. You don't do that. You don't stick to your guns like that if you've got 0 balls whatsoever. The show adds so much depth to the man and his decision, which would end up irreparably damaging his family's power, which would only wane after this War of Succession. Fire and Blood has simple characters, which is faithful to how histories like this are generally written, whereas the show depicts much more complicated characters. I wrote on my chalkboard in a recent crackdown that I was not going to watch the new Game of Thrones spin-off.
I don't want it.
After the conclusion of Game of Thrones, I frankly wanted nothing to do with any of the television adaptations. The problem is, the world of A Song of Ice and Fire deserves spin-offs. It is undoubtedly the most engrossing fictional world I've ever seen. It is so well realized that a massive aspect of its world building is unreliable narrators. The rock solid and well thought out foundations of this world, paired with the in-universe arguments between dusty old scholarly dickheads, is what every lover of history lives for. And the fan base has a proud tradition of arguing about the reliability and biases of these narrators. There are many situations where Fire and Blood offers several different versions of events, one of which is shown to be correct in the show. By the way, Mushroom's account is right like 75% of the time, so he probably did have a huge dick, by the way. Adaptations of novels tend to feel inferior to the source text. Like, they're less canon. But in this case, there's a fascinating relationship between these two. These feel like how these events really went down. Perspective is an incredibly important theme in A Song of Ice and Fire. I'd argue the most important one. Each chapter is presented from the point of view of a character, and while in Sansa's head, I can see how Theon is a monster, in Theon's head, I feel nothing but pity. While in Catelyn's head, I can understand how Jaime is an unreliable oathbreaker. In Jaime's head, I feel he's more reliable than half the goddamn characters in these books. This playing with perspective feeds wonderfully into the world building, because the world building is written from a narrow, compromised, and imperfect view. As Herodotus has gone down in history a fool for taking everything at face value, so too can the reader be blinded by the limitations of their perspective. The House of the Dragon captures this in a fascinating way. I feel that the show excels at seeing through the bullshit in the source text and brings the truth to life. It, in fact, reminds me of one of my favorite quotes, as said by the philosopher king, Emperor Marcus Aurelius. Everything we hear is an opinion, not a fact. Everything we see is a perspective, not the truth.
I must admit my confusion. I do not understand why petitions are being heard over settled succession.